Throughout the generations, Indigenous peoples have been faced with difficult challenges which have shaped the struggles that they face today. Out of many of the challenges faced, the two that I will be discussing are about residential schools and the Sixties scoop, and more importantly, how these institutions and practices resulted in generational trauma and widespread identity loss across the entire nation. Let's start with the elephant in the room: residential schools. Something that went on for 122 years in Canada, and which many Canadians still do not fully understand to this day. For over a century, children were removed from their homes and sent off to residential schools, where the objective set by the Canadian government was to assimilate them into Euro-Canadian culture. The residential school system was first established in the 1880s. The way that the Canadian government saw it was Indigenous people were lower on the hierarchy than the white man, and in order to become less savage, assimilation would be required by killing the Indian in the child and bringing Indigenous ideologies on par with Euro-Canadian and Christian ways of thinking and living. To achieve this result, residential schools were operated by churches and nuns. The system forcibly removed Indigenous children from their homes for extended periods of time. During their time at the schools, children were forbidden to acknowledge their Aboriginal culture and heritage, and were not even allowed to speak their own language. If any of these rules were broken, extremely strict punishments were handed out. Living conditions at residential schools were also created in a way that stripped Indigenous children of their identity. Students were required to cut their hair, don uniforms, and pray throughout the day. Boys and girls were also separated, and some siblings did not even know that their own brothers or sisters were within the same walls. Abuse at residential schools was rampant. Survivors recount many stories of physical abuse, mental abuse, and sexual abuse being normal. Some even had needles stuck in their tongues for speaking native languages. Disease was widespread, and many students who attended residential schools did not survive. A second historical time in our nation that led to cultural genocide and a loss of Indigenous identity was the Sixties scoop. The scoop occurred between the 1960s and 1980s. It was an event which saw thousands of Indigenous children taken from their homes by service workers. Instead of going to a school, this time they were being placed to live with mainly non-Aboriginal families. The Sixties scoop truly signifies the lack of care or respect that the Canadian government promised Indigenous peoples. As the government began slowly phasing out residential schools, they instead allowed the Sixties scoop to go on for nearly 2 decades, showing that they really did not care about Indigenous rights or identity conservation like they seem to be putting on this act of doing. Many children taken in the Sixties scoop were even sent to live with families in other provinces or other countries, which made reconnecting with their identity and roots almost impossible. Indigenous peoples who went through the Sixties scoop describe it as cultural genocide, with many losing everything, including name, family, language, and culture. What both residential schools and the Sixties scoop have in common is that they both stripped Indigenous peoples of their identity and sense of belonging. This has led to generational trauma and generational identity loss, which is felt by Indigenous peoples who are not even directly affected by these two historical impacts. Think about it. If your mother or father were divided from their identity, then their children would also be separated, as would the next generation. Although the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has tried to mend fences and the government has issued an apology, sometimes the damage is already done. The generational trauma and identity loss has manifested itself in the forms of alcoholism, substance abuse, and suicide for many Indigenous peoples. This trauma and sense of self-worthlessness is definitely a direct result of the residential school system, the Sixties scoop, and many other historical moments throughout Canada's history. Many Indigenous peoples grow up to this very day and feel as though they don't belong to mainstream society or the Indigenous community. Although government apologies and acknowledgement are correct steps, they simply are not enough in reconciliation. Government focus should be put towards creating programs which look to strengthen Indigenous communities. Programs around language, restoration, and cultural appreciation should be implemented immediately. Although the government argues it is doing some of these things in respect to land rights, repatriation rights, more can be done and should be done. Strengthening the identity that remains is paramount in restoring what has been lost for Indigenous people for far too long.